a Newton for the 19th century. He unlocked the secret behind all life on Earth. One of the luckiest men in history, he was also one of the most brilliant. How did this Englishman demonstrate the truth of one of the oldest ideas in history? And how did the evolution of his discovery in turn impact the major forces of history that we have already seen? Liberalism and nationalism, as well as give rise to imperialism, Marxism, and a new understanding of psychology and philosophy. In this podcast, we will look at the author of the most influential book of the 19th century, Charles Darwin, and the theory of evolution of the species by natural selection. To begin with, Charles Darwin was a very lucky man. On February 12, 1809, the same day that Abraham Lincoln was born in a rude log cabin in Kentucky, Charles Darwin was born in high society London. Unlike Lincoln, who described the life history of his family as the short and simple annals of the poor, Darwin was born to a family of wealthy celebrities with several geniuses in his immediate family tree, including both of his grandfathers and his father. Because of his family's wealth and inheritance, he never had to teach, work for a living, or cater to the opinions of senior professors to support himself and his family. He could devote all his hours to his chief love, conducting research on a variety of small life forms, especially birds, insects, and barnacles. But we're getting a bit ahead of the story. Darwin's grandfather, Erasmus Darwin, was one of the great scientists of the 18th century, a genius who was one of the most famous voices for the idea that all life forms have evolved from simpler predecessors through an evolutionary process since the beginning of time. This was not a new idea. Even before Socrates, 500 years before the Christian era, some had argued in favor of evolution. Erasmus was not quite as famous as two French evolutionists who also lived at the end of the 18th century, Comte de Buffon and Jean-Baptiste de Lamarck. But he, like they, were impressed with the sheer number of species in the world, tens of thousands of them. And all three men argued that there were just too many species for them to be separate creations as the Christian view had held. Erasmus Darwin was like Copernicus, who challenged the Christian view that the Earth was the center of the solar system. He was also like Copernicus in being unable to discover the mechanism by how species might evolve into new species. And so most Englishmen continued to believe in the idea of separate creations over 7 days, as stated in Genesis. In 1804, for example, a minister named William Paley wrote a book that explained why all species had to be designed separately by God. He pointed out that if we discovered a watch in the forest, we would conclude from its mechanisms that work together so well for a preconceived purpose, namely to reveal the time, that that watch had to have been designed by somebody for a purpose. It was not some random natural object that had just happened to appear out of nowhere. Paley pointed out that everything in our experience that looks as if it were designed actually is designed, including the watch. Paley thought that since all life in nature appears to have been designed, it must have been designed, and therefore it must have a designer. To observe the speed of a cougar, the ability of a walking stick insect to blend into its background, and the parts of a bird that enable flight, was to see something that had to be designed for a purpose, and that designer had to be God. Darwin read Paley's book. He liked the way Paley organized his argument, but being a scientist, Darwin did not agree with his conclusion. The claim had not been proven. It would take research and experimentation to prove or disprove evolution. William Paley had done neither. Darwin's maternal grandfather was another genius, Josiah Wedgwood, the Jeff Bezos of his era. Wedgwood built a business that was the wonder of the English world. Every part of the business was designed to make a profit. One of Wedgwood's daughters became Darwin's mother. Wedgwood's genes would contribute to the Darwin family's ability to be good investors and makers of money. In fact, all of Darwin's ancestors passed down to him a genetic inheritance that would make him a genius like them. It was ironic because Darwin all his life knew nothing about genes or genetics, that branch of science not being widely known until after his death. But the science of genetics would provide the final piece of the puzzle to complete Darwin's theory. As I said, though, Darwin was a lucky man. It was not necessary to learn about genetics to demonstrate the workings or the existence of natural selection, only to lay any remaining doubt to rest. Therefore, he could become much celebrated and applauded as the man who demonstrated the origin of the species, even without genetics. Darwin's theory would do most of the heavy lifting of confirming evolution, but it would also have some dark and deadly consequences that Darwin was not entirely innocent of spawning. Had Darwin known about genetics, he might not have added the unnecessary descriptions that would make them time bombs with some awful side effects in the future. Darwin's father, Robert, another genius, was concerned that his son's hobby of collecting bugs would not suit him for a good future. He sent him to Cambridge, first to study law, and then, ironically, to study for the clergy of the Church of England. But these subjects would not take. Darwin, the bug collector, decided to follow in his paternal grandfather's footsteps and, like Erasmus, go for a career in biology. There were two other important ways in which Darwin was lucky. One was in his ability to win friends and influence people, and the other, as we will see, was in his choice of a bride. Darwin was a hypochondriac, always convinced he was at death's door from some stomach problem or another, and he preferred solitary research to socializing. But he could pretend to be a social butterfly, and the world was convinced that he was a people person, and a most agreeable one at that. He drew people, important people, to him like moths to a flame, and they could help him get opportunities that would serve a young scientist well. One of these opportunities came in 1834, when the 20-something-year-old Darwin was given the opportunity to accompany the captain of the HMS Beagle on an around-the-world 5-year trip. The captain could use the companionship of a Cambridge man on the long voyage, and Darwin could conduct biological research on the species he found at dozens of points all over the world along the way. The voyage of the Beagle would be decisive for Darwin's career. It would furnish him with the data that would prove evolution and confirm its mechanism, which no one before had thought of: natural selection. It would also make him a celebrity scientist even before he published his findings, because the voyage proved that Darwin was a serious scientist who was on the hunt for the mechanism behind evolution. What the world did not know, and would not learn for another 20 years, was that because of the voyage, Darwin had actually found that mechanism. In the course of the voyage, Darwin visited the Galapagos Islands off the coast of Peru. There he found species that were slightly different, depending on the island in the chain where they nested. And he also discovered that finches on all the islands were even more different than the more distant finches on the mainland. giant turtles 3 feet long and longer, found nowhere else, lumbered along within the Galapagos Islands. The principle of natural selection was demonstrated. Nature selects those individuals who survive a competition for scarce resources by providing such individuals small traits, making them more adaptable to their environment. These traits were not purposely provided, but because of scarce resources and a survival of the fittest, natural selection operates just the same as if it were purposeful. That is, species become more complex and well adapted to survive because of a non-random but non-designed process. We have no parallels to this in our everyday experience. If something is non-random, it is almost by definition designed. This is why natural selection is at first hard to believe. It does not accord with our everyday experience. But then again, it takes a long time to unfold. In this connection, Darwin was again lucky that a famous geologist, Charles Lyell, had just shown that the world was many hundreds of millions of years old, long enough for an evolution of species to have occurred. Darwin found that species adapt to their environment because they have to in order to survive. The individuals that survive just happen to have advantageous traits, a slightly longer tail, stronger legs, and so on, that allow them to beat their competition long enough to reproduce and pass these traits to their offspring. None of this is planned, but over a sufficiently long period of time, such minute changes can produce such profound changes in a species, always in the direction of what we would consider to be progressive change to more complexity and efficiency, so as to bring about wholly new species. Large turtles exist only on the Galapagos because there were no wolves there to eat them before they could become so large, as there were everywhere else. They were well adapted to their environment because they had no predators there. But everywhere else, large turtles would be toast in the face of predators from wolves to coyotes, and so we have no such large turtles elsewhere. When Darwin returned to England, he proceeded to do nothing for the next 20 years except accumulate more and more evidence for natural selection without publishing his discovery. There were 2 reasons for this. First, Darwin, always the worrywart, was afraid that he might be hit with violence by the church, the government, or some mob if he came out with his theory. But after 1839, he had a more personal worry. That year, he had married the love of his life, Emma, who was a devout Christian. Darwin worried that he would cause much distress for her once he published a theory so utterly incompatible with a literal reading of the Bible. So he kept putting off the vital matter of publication. Emma gave Charles 10 children and a lifetime of devoted love. She was proud of his talent and commitment to his work, but she always gently tried to convince him of the truth of the Christian God, sincerely believing that it would help him, while knowing that he would have none of it. Darwin saw how violent and red in tooth and claw nature was. He was convinced that natural selection worked as a result of such violence, and he could not believe that any God would subject his creations to such tortures. When his beloved daughter Annie died at the age of 10 in 1851, any possibility that Darwin would believe in a loving God of justice was ended forever.